On the 3rd of April, 1814, the golden light of late afternoon spilled through the tall windows of the Dowager Duchess's sitting room, casting long shadows across the worn carpet and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the still air like tiny spirits of forgotten seasons. Eleanor Whitmore sat in her customary chair by the window, a volume of Virgil open upon her lap, though her eyes had long since ceased to follow the familiar Latin verses, and instead gazed out toward the west gardens, where the first brave daffodils nodded their yellow heads against the cool spring breeze. 3 years she had occupied this chair, 3 years of quiet service to the Dowager Duchess Helena, and in that time she had learned to make herself as unobtrusive as the furniture itself, as easily overlooked as the faded grey dress she wore day after day, until its seams had memorized the shape of her unremarkable figure. Her mousy brown hair was pinned back severely from her plain features, and when she shifted her position, her left leg ached with the familiar reminder of the childhood fever that had left her with a slight but noticeable limp, a permanent mark of imperfection that society had long ago judged and dismissed. From somewhere in the corridor beyond, she could hear the urgent whispers of servants, their voices carrying that particular tension that had gripped the household for days now. "Poor creature," one of the maids had murmured just that morning, thinking Eleanor could not hear. 27 and lame and plain as a sparrow, what future could she possibly hope for beyond fetching shawls for the old Duchess to... Eleanor had smiled at her Virgil and said nothing, for she had learned that silence was the armor of the invisible, and invisibility was the price of her survival. The Dowager herself dozed lightly in her chair across the room, her aged face peaceful in repose, and Eleanor felt a surge of genuine affection for the woman who had never once made her feel like a servant, who asked her opinions on poetry and politics and listened to her answers as though they mattered. But even that warmth could not quite dispel the chill that ran through the household at the news that had arrived 3 days prior, the news that His Grace the Duke of Ashworth was returning at last after 2 years abroad, returning tomorrow to reclaim his estate. The servants whispered with barely concealed excitement, perhaps finally to choose a bride. Frederick Ashworth, whose reputation preceded him like a winter frost, cold and exacting and impossible to please, a man who had publicly declared he would marry nothing less than perfection of bloodline and beauty. Eleanor turned another page she had not read, and allowed herself a small, private smile at her own foolishness for even noting such information. For what could the return of a duke possibly mean to a vicar's daughter with a lame leg and a head full of Greek, a woman who had made peace with her spinsterhood, as one makes peace with an old wound that aches only when the weather changes? Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The morning of April 4th, 1814 dawned bright and clear. Spring sunshine flooding through the windows of Ashworth House with an almost aggressive cheerfulness that seemed to mock the nervous energy crackling through every corridor and servant's passage. Eleanor had positioned herself at the window of the Dowager's sitting room, ostensibly arranging a vase of early hyacinths, but in truth watching the long drive that curved through the parkland toward the house, her heart beating with an anticipation she refused to name or examine too closely. She wore the same faded grey dress as yesterday, for she owned few others, and her hair was pinned back with the same severe practicality that had become her armor against a world that had long ago decided she was not worth adorning. The Dowager dozed in her chair, untroubled by the household's anxiety. And Eleanor envied her that peace even as she found her own gaze drawn again and again to the drive. Shortly before 11, the carriage appeared, a grand thing pulled by 4 matched black horses, and Eleanor watched as it swept to a halt before the main entrance, watched as the footmen scrambled to attention, watched as a tall figure in dusty traveling clothes emerged and stood for a moment, surveying his domain with an expression she could not read from this distance but imagined to be cold. Frederick Ashworth, Duke of Ashworth, had come home. She turned quickly from the window, too quickly, and her left leg protested the sudden movement, causing her to stumble slightly against the windowsill. The dowager stirred and murmured something about fetching her spectacles, and Eleanor seized upon the errand gratefully. Slipping from the sitting-room into the corridor beyond where she might compose herself, away from the commotion of arrival. She had not counted on the Duke himself striding through that very corridor, his boots still bearing the dust of travel, his dark hair dishevelled, and his handsome face set in lines of exhaustion, and something harder, something that made her press herself against the wall as though she might disappear into the wallpaper. He passed within 3 feet of her, close enough that she could smell horse and road and something spicier beneath, and his eyes swept over her without pause, without recognition, without the slightest flicker of acknowledgement that she existed at all. She was a piece of furniture, a shadow, nothing. She heard him enter his grandmother's sitting-room, heard the dowager's delighted exclamation, heard their voices in conversation as she stood frozen in the corridor. And then she heard the words that would echo in her mind for days afterward, spoken in a voice as cold and clear as winter ice. "That creature in the hallway," the Duke said with evident distaste. "I presume she is your companion." "Grandmother, you cannot expect me to tolerate such a presence at table. She will never be a duchess, nor anything of consequence. Let her take her meals in her room where she belongs." Eleanor's hands trembled as she pressed them flat against the cool wall, her limp suddenly more pronounced as she turned and made her way back toward the servants' stairs. And she told herself the burning in her eyes was only the spring dust, and nothing more, nothing at all. The evening of April 5th, 1814, found the great dining room of Ashworth House ablaze with the light of 40 candles, their flames reflected in the polished silver and crystal that adorned the long mahogany table, casting dancing shadows across the silk wallpaper and the stern faces of ancestral portraits that gazed down upon the scene with painted disapproval. Eleanor sat at the far end of the table, placed there by design and custom in her role as companion. So distant from the Duke and his grandmother that she might have been dining in another room entirely, her grey dress blending with the shadows between the candelabras until she felt herself becoming one with the dim corners of the room. She ate little, speaking less. Her wounded pride wrapped tightly around her like a second skin as she focused on the mechanics of lifting fork to mouth, and appearing as invisible as the Duke clearly believed her to be. Frederick himself sat at the head of the table, his handsome face set in lines of irritation as the dowager, undeterred by his cold demeanour, spoke with elaborate casualness about Lady Beatrice Langdon, that diamond of the season whose beauty and breeding made her the obvious choice for his duchess. "I have no interest in discussing marriage this evening, grandmother," he said, his voice carrying the length of the table with that aristocratic clarity that seemed bred into men of his station, and Eleanor watched from her distant seat as the dowager merely smiled and changed tactics with the skill of a seasoned general. She produced from somewhere a small volume of poetry, its leather binding worn with age, and announced that she had been puzzling over a particular Latin phrase all afternoon and could not quite capture its meaning. "Eleanor, my dear," the dowager called down the table, her voice cutting through Eleanor's careful invisibility like a blade through silk. "You have such a gift for languages. Perhaps you might assist me with this passage from Catullus." Eleanor felt the blood rise to her cheeks as every eye in the room turned toward her, including those cold grey eyes at the head of the table that had looked through her as though she were made of glass. She accepted the book from a footman who carried it the length of the table, her hands steady, despite the trembling in her chest. and read the Latin aloud in a clear voice before translating without hesitation. "Let us live and love, and value at a single penny all the talk of stern old men, for suns may set and rise again, but we, when once our brief light fails, must sleep through one perpetual night." She looked up to find Frederick staring at her with an expression she could not read, one dark eyebrow raised in what might have been surprise or skepticism or something else entirely. And for a long moment their eyes held across the candle-lit expanse of the dining room before he looked away and reached for his wine-glass, but not before Eleanor caught the flicker of something in his gaze that looked almost like curiosity, almost like the first crack in a wall of ice, and she told herself it meant nothing, nothing at all, even as her foolish heart insisted on beating faster. The morning of April 8, 1814, arrived beneath a sky the color of pewter, clouds hanging low and heavy over the parkland, as though the weather itself had decided to match the unsettled state of Eleanor's heart. And she had retreated to the library, as had become her habit on days when the dowager napped and the household seemed to forget she existed, seeking solace among the towering mahogany shelves and the comforting smell of leather and old paper that reminded her of her father's study in the vicarage where she had spent the happiest hours of her childhood. The library at Ashworth House boasted 2 great fireplaces, both unlit on this mild spring morning, and Eleanor had settled herself in a window seat with a worn copy of Plato's Symposium, her fingers tracing the Greek text with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance, while outside the first drops of rain began to spatter against the glass. She was so absorbed in the dialogue on love, that strange and sacred madness that the ancient philosophers debated with such earnestness, that she did not hear the door open, did not sense his presence until a voice spoke from somewhere behind her, startling her so badly that the book tumbled from her lap, and she scrambled to her feet with an awkwardness that made her left leg protest sharply, her limp pronounced and ungainly as she turned to face Frederick Ashworth, standing just inside the doorway with an expression of surprise that mirrored her own. "I did not expect to find anyone here," he said, his voice carrying that familiar coolness, though something flickered in his grey eyes as they moved from her flushed face to the book now lying open on the floor. Eleanor bent to retrieve it, grateful for the excuse to hide her burning cheeks. And when she straightened, he had moved closer, close enough that she could see the fine weave of his coat and the way his dark hair curled slightly at his temples, despite his obvious efforts to tame it. "Plato," he observed, and there was something in his tone that was not quite mockery but perhaps its cousin. "You read Greek as well as Latin, Miss Whitmore. My father believed education should not be limited by circumstance or sex, Your Grace," she replied, finding her voice and with it a fragment of her pride. Frederick's eyebrow rose in that expression she remembered from the dinner table, that flicker of curiosity that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds, and for a long moment neither of them spoke while the rain intensified outside, drumming against the windows with increasing urgency. He asked her then about the dialogue, whether she found Aristophanes' speech on love convincing, and she answered without thinking, her passion for the text overriding her caution, speaking of souls split in two and the eternal search for one's missing half, until she caught herself and fell silent, suddenly aware that she had been speaking to the Duke of Ashworth as though he were a colleague rather than her employer's grandson. Frederick's expression had shifted during her speech, something warming in those cold eyes. But as the silence stretched between them, she watched him remember himself, watched the walls rebuild behind his gaze as he stepped back and inclined his head with distant politeness. "You are more learned than I expected," he said. "But learning does not alter one's station, Miss Whitmore." And then he was gone, leaving her alone with the rain and the ache in her chest that she refused to name. The afternoon of April the 15th, 1814, brought with it a deluge that seemed determined to wash away the fragile spring, rain falling in sheets so thick that the world beyond the windows of Ashworth House dissolved into a grey and formless blur, and Eleanor stood in the shadowed alcove of the upper gallery, her serviceable brown dress rendering her nearly invisible against the dark wood panelling, as she watched the commotion in the grand entrance hall below, where the marble floors gleamed wet with tracked rainwater, and servants scurried like ants disturbed from their hill. The Langdon carriage had arrived despite the weather, its occupants clearly unwilling to delay their prize for something so mundane as a storm, and Eleanor pressed herself deeper into the shadows as the great doors swung open to reveal Lady Beatrice Langdon stepping across the threshold in a confection of pale pink silk that seemed to glow against the grey afternoon light, her golden hair arranged in perfect ringlets beneath a bonnet that likely cost more than Eleanor earned in a year. She was everything Eleanor was not, this diamond of the season. Tall and willowy where Eleanor was merely slight, her features arranged with the kind of symmetry that poets wrote sonnets about, her movements graceful as a swan gliding across still water, and Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest as she watched Frederick emerge from his study to greet his guests with formal precision. He bowed over Lady Beatrice's gloved hand with the practiced ease of a man who had performed such courtesies 1,000 times, his face betraying nothing as her mother simpered about the dreadful journey, and her father boomed jovially about the pleasures of country air, and Eleanor told herself firmly that the week since their conversation in the library had meant nothing. That whatever spark of curiosity had flickered in his grey eyes had been extinguished the moment he reminded her that learning does not alter one's station. Lady Beatrice laughed at something Frederick said, the sound carrying up to where Eleanor stood hidden, and even that was perfect. A musical trill that spoke of finishing schools and dancing masters and a lifetime of being taught exactly how to please. And Eleanor saw the way the beautiful woman laid her fingers on Frederick's arm with proprietary confidence, already certain of her conquest. But then something shifted. A servant stumbled slightly while carrying a trunk, and Lady Beatrice's lovely face contorted for just a moment into something sharp and ugly as she snapped at the poor girl with a cruelty that seemed at odds with her angelic appearance. And Eleanor watched Frederick's expression flicker almost imperceptibly before smoothing back into polite neutrality. Eleanor began to retreat, her left leg protesting as she moved too quickly on the uneven gallery floor, knowing she had no business watching, no right to feel the ache that spread through her chest like spilled ink. And she was nearly to the servant's stare when some instinct made her glance back one final time to find Frederick's gaze lifted to the gallery, his grey eyes finding her in the shadows with an intensity that stopped her breath. And for one endless moment, they stared at each other across the rain-washed light before Eleanor turned and fled, her limp pronounced and graceless, her foolish heart pounding with a hope she knew she had no right to feel. The evening of April 17th, 1814, found the drawing-room of Ashworth House ablaze with candlelight and the brittle gaiety of forced entertainment, the air heavy with perfume and the cloying sweetness of hothouse flowers that Lady Beatrice had insisted upon despite the season, and Eleanor sat in her customary position near the dowager's chair, her grey dress fading into the shadows of the corner, while the glittering assembly occupied the center of the room like jeweled birds preening for admiration. Lady Beatrice had positioned herself at the pianoforte with the confidence of one who had never been told she lacked talent, her fingers striking the keys with more enthusiasm than skill, while her mother beamed and the gentlemen arranged their faces into expressions of polite appreciation, and Eleanor kept her eyes on her needlework, though her fingers had stilled, watching through lowered lashes as Frederick stood by the fireplace with an expression of such carefully maintained neutrality that she recognized it instantly as profound boredom. Thomas Sinclair lounged in a chair nearby, his dark eyes moving between his cousin and the beautiful woman at the instrument, with a calculating gleam that made Eleanor uneasy, though she could not have said why. And when the piece mercifully concluded and scattered applause filled the room, Lady Beatrice rose from the bench with a graceful curtsy that swept her white muslin skirts across the carpet, like foam on a wave. "How delightful," the dowager murmured with diplomatic vagueness, and then because she was old and wealthy and cared little for pretense. She added, "Eleanor, my dear, would you fetch my shawl from the chair by the window, the blue one? This room has grown rather warm with so much exertion." Eleanor rose immediately, her left leg stiff from sitting, and she had taken perhaps 3 steps when Lady Beatrice's musical voice carried across the room with perfect clarity. "Oh, do watch how she walks. It is rather like a wounded sparrow attempting to hop. Is it not simply tragic?" And the titter of laughter that followed struck Eleanor like a physical blow, though she did not falter, did not stop, continued toward the window with her chin held level and her cheeks burning. The silence that fell afterward was sudden and complete, broken only by the sharp crack of Frederick's voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I find nothing tragic in courage, Lady Beatrice, nor anything amusing in cruelty," and Eleanor turned with the shawl clutched in her trembling hands to find Frederick's grey eyes fixed not on Beatrice, but on her, something fierce and almost angry burning in their depths. And for one suspended moment, the rest of the room ceased to exist. Lady Beatrice's lovely face had gone pale with shock, and then flushed with humiliation, her mouth opening and closing without sound, while Thomas Sinclair leaned forward in his chair with sudden sharp interest, and the dowager smiled a small, secret smile into her handkerchief, and Eleanor walked back to her mistress on legs that felt like water, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it, unable to look away from Frederick, until she reached her chair and sank into it, the shawl forgotten in her lap, knowing that something fundamental had shifted in the air between them, and terrified of what it might mean. The morning of April the 20th, 1814, dawned with a soft mist that clung to the gardens of Ashworth House like gauze wrapped around a wound, the pale light filtering through the haze to illuminate the gravel paths and the dormant rose bushes whose thorny branches stood bare and waiting for the warmth that would coax them into bloom, and Eleanor walked among them with her shawl pulled tight against the chill, her left leg aching from the cold damp, but her spirit craving the solitude that only these early hours could provide. When the house still slept and she could pretend, if only for a moment, that she was not a woman living on the charity of others, but simply herself, whole and free and belonging to no one's expectations. She had spent 3 days since the drawing-room incident, turning his words over in her mind like stones worn smooth by water. "I find nothing tragic in courage, nor anything amusing in cruelty." And each time she examined them, she found new facets to wonder at, new reasons to doubt her own interpretation, for surely a man who had looked through her as though she were made of glass could not have meant what his defense seemed to imply. Surely she was foolish to let her heart quicken at the memory of his grey eyes finding hers across that glittering room. The crunch of boots on gravel reached her ears before she saw him, and Eleanor turned too quickly, her bad leg protesting on the uneven ground so that she stumbled slightly before catching herself. And there was Frederick in his riding clothes, his dark hair still disordered by the morning air, his expression shifting through something she could not name before settling into careful neutrality as he approached. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and then, as if the words surprised him, "I did not expect to find anyone about at this hour," and Eleanor knew she should curtsy and excuse herself, and flee back to the safety of the house. But instead she heard herself say, "I often walk in the mornings." "Your Grace, the garden is peaceful before the world wakes," and something in his face softened almost imperceptibly as he fell into step beside her without invitation, matching his pace to her slower gait, with a naturalness that made her throat tight. They walked in silence for a long moment, the mist swirling around their ankles, until Frederick spoke again with a hesitance she had never heard from him. "My grandmother tells me your father was a man of great learning," and Eleanor found herself answering honestly for the first time in years. "He was a country vicar who believed that knowledge was the only inheritance he could leave me. He taught me Latin and Greek and philosophy, because he said a well-furnished mind was a fortress no one could breach." And when she looked up, she found Frederick watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch, his grey eyes warm in the pale morning light, and she knew with sudden terrifying certainty that this softening between them was more dangerous than any cruelty he could have offered. For cruelty she knew how to survive, but kindness from this man might be her undoing. The afternoon of April 25th, 1814, brought sunshine that held no warmth. The cold wind cutting through the corridors of Ashworth House and finding Eleanor in the servants' passage where she had no business being, though she had taken this route 100 times before to avoid the main halls when guests were about, her serviceable brown dress blending with the stone walls as she made her way toward the still room where Mrs. Pennington had asked her to fetch dried lavender for the dowager's headache, and it was only chance that made her pause at the sound of voices around the corner, only instinct that pressed her back against the cold wall behind a faded tapestry depicting some ancient hunt, her heart beginning to pound before her mind had even registered why she should hide. Thomas Sinclair's voice was unmistakable, that smooth, cultured drawl that always seemed to carry an undercurrent of something unpleasant, and he was speaking to someone whose responses came in the rough whisper of a servant who knew better than to be overheard, and Eleanor held her breath as the words filtered through the dusty fabric. "Our dear cousin grows distracted," Thomas was saying, his tone carrying amusement that did not reach humor. "I had thought the Langdon girl would settle matters quickly, but he seems remarkably reluctant to commit." And the servant murmured something Eleanor could not catch, and Thomas laughed softly. "If he remains unmarried another year, if some accident should befall him before an heir is produced, well, these things happen, do they not? The title must pass somewhere." And Eleanor's blood turned to ice in her veins as she pressed harder against the wall, her bad leg trembling beneath her, watching through a gap in the tapestry as Thomas's hand moved into view, his distinctive signet ring with its coiled serpent catching the dim light as he passed something to the servant, coins perhaps, or a folded note. And then his voice dropped lower. "Keep me informed of his movements, his habits, where he rides alone." And the servant's footsteps retreated down the passage while Thomas lingered, humming softly to himself, the sound so casual and content that it made Eleanor's stomach turn with horror at what she had just heard. She remained frozen long after his footsteps faded, her mind racing through the implications. Thomas who stood to inherit if Frederick died without issue. Thomas who smiled so pleasantly at dinner while plotting something Eleanor could not quite name, but understood in her bones to be monstrous. And she thought of Frederick's grey eyes warming as they walked in the garden, thought of his voice saying her father must have been remarkable, thought of the way he had defended her against Beatrice's cruelty, and she knew with sudden terrible clarity that she could not keep silent, that whatever risk it posed to her position, whatever suspicion it might cast upon her motives, she would have to warn him, would have to find a way to make him believe a plain spinster companion who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking. And as she finally moved from her hiding place on shaking legs, Eleanor understood that this choice was already made, had perhaps been made, the moment he first truly looked at her. The evening of April 27th, 1814, found Eleanor standing outside the door of Frederick's study, with her heart hammering so violently against her ribs that she feared the sound might echo through the quiet corridor, the full moon casting silver light through the tall windows and illuminating the polished floors, while she gathered what remained of her courage, for she had spent 2 days wrestling with what she had overheard in the servants' passage, 2 days of watching Thomas smile pleasantly at dinner while knowing the serpent that coiled behind his charming facade. And now she could delay no longer, could not in good conscience let another night pass without speaking, even if Frederick dismissed her as mad, or scheming, or simply beneath his notice. She knocked before she could lose her nerve, and his voice came sharp and surprised through the heavy oak. "Enter." And she stepped into a room she had never seen before, all dark wood paneling and maps of the estate, spread across a massive desk, a single candelabra throwing warm light across Frederick's face as he rose from his chair, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion to something more guarded as he recognized her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and the way he spoke her name had changed since those first days, had lost its dismissiveness, and gained an uncertainty that matched her own. "This is highly irregular," and Eleanor heard herself say. "I know, Your Grace, and I would not disturb you if it were not a matter of grave importance," her voice steadier than she felt, and she watched something flicker across his features, curiosity perhaps, or concern, as he gestured to a chair before the fire that she was too agitated to take. She told him everything, the words tumbling out in a rush, the servants' corridor, Thomas's voice, the signet ring catching the light. Keep me informed of his movements where he rides alone. And as she spoke, she watched Frederick's face harden into something dangerous, watched his hands clench at his sides, and when she finished, he was silent for a long, terrible moment before he said, "Why are you telling me this?" his voice rough with something she could not name. And Eleanor answered with the only truth she had, "Because whatever you think of me, Your Grace, whatever I am or am not, I could not live with myself if something happened that I might have prevented." And the clock on the mantel struck 11, the chimes falling between them like stones into still water, and Frederick moved toward her, closer than he had ever stood, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat. "You have nothing to gain from this warning," he said slowly, as if working through a puzzle that confounded him. "You risk my disbelief, my suspicion, perhaps your position, and yet you came." And Eleanor whispered, "Not everyone wants something from you," and she saw the words land like a blow, saw something break open behind his grey eyes, and when he reached out and took her hand in both of his, a gesture of gratitude that burned through her glove and into her very bones, she understood that this moment had changed everything between them, had forged a bond of shared danger that neither of them could pretend away. And as she trembled beneath his touch, she knew with terrible certainty that she was already lost. The morning of May the 2nd, 1814, arrived wrapped in grey rain that streaked down the windows of the dowager's sitting room like tears the sky could no longer contain. And Eleanor sat in her usual chair with a cup of tea growing cold between her hands, her grey dress seeming to absorb what little light filtered through the clouds as she listened to the dowager speak words that fell upon her like stones. "My grandson has made his decision," the old woman said with a heaviness that suggested she took no pleasure in delivering this news. "He intends to propose to Lady Beatrice before the week is out," and Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, felt the careful walls she had been building since that night in his study crumble to dust because she had been foolish enough to hope, foolish enough to believe that the warmth in his eyes when he took her hand meant something more than gratitude, foolish enough to imagine that a plain spinster with a limp and a seamstress for a mother could matter to a duke who had duties and bloodlines and centuries of expectation weighing upon his shoulders. She heard herself say something appropriate, something about being happy for his grace, something about Lady Beatrice being a fortunate woman, and the dowager reached across the space between them to grip Eleanor's fingers with surprising strength, her aged eyes too knowing, too full of the sorrow that comes from watching someone you care for walk willingly into pain. "You do not have to pretend with me, child," she said softly. "I have watched you both these past weeks, and I had hoped—" But Eleanor pulled her hand away gently, because she could not bear kindness just now, could not withstand compassion when she needed every fragment of her composure to survive the next minutes until she could be alone. The hours that followed passed in a blur of duties performed with mechanical precision, of corridors navigated with her head down and her heart bleeding invisibly beneath her serviceable grey wool. And twice she glimpsed Frederick at a distance, once crossing the great hall with Thomas at his side, and once disappearing into the library where they had first truly spoken. And both times he did not look toward her, did not seek her out as he had done in the garden, did not acknowledge with even a glance that anything had ever passed between them, and his avoidance told her everything his words had not. Told her that whatever she had imagined growing between them had been nothing but the desperate invention of a lonely woman who should have known better than to dream. It was only later, much later, when the house had fallen quiet and the rain had settled into a steady rhythm against the roof of her small chamber beneath the eaves, that Eleanor allowed herself to sit on the edge of her narrow bed and press her hands against her face and weep for the father who had taught her to value her mind when the world valued only beauty, weep for the hope she had nursed so secretly these past weeks, weep for the way Frederick's hand had felt wrapped around hers in the candlelight of his study, and most of all weep for the woman she had glimpsed in his eyes, the woman worthy of being seen, who had turned out to be nothing but a ghost, after all. The evening of May the 5th, 1814, blazed with the light of 200 candles reflected in gilt-framed mirrors that lined the ballroom of Ashworth House, their flames multiplied into infinity and casting golden warmth across the assembled guests who had come to celebrate what all of society believed would soon be the engagement of the Duke of Ashworth to Lady Beatrice Langdon. And Eleanor stood in the corner beside the dowager's chair, wearing her best dress, a plain blue muslin that had seemed adequate when she purchased it 3 years ago, but now felt like a declaration of her own insignificance among the silks and satins and diamonds that glittered on every other woman in the room, her hands folded quietly at her waist as she watched the dancers swirl through a waltz she could never join, her damaged leg aching from standing so long on the polished marble floor while she performed her duty of invisibility with the same dedication she brought to everything else in her diminished life. Beatrice swept past in a gown of white silk adorned with seed pearls, her golden hair caught up with diamond pins that caught the candlelight and scattered it like captured stars. And she was laughing at something Frederick had said, her hand possessive on his arm. And Eleanor made herself look away because she had spent 3 days learning to swallow grief like medicine. And she would not falter now, would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing the cracks in her composure. Even as she felt Frederick's gaze upon her from across the room, felt it like heat, like pressure, like something she could not name and dared not hope to understand. The music ended, and Beatrice detached herself from Frederick's arm to accept refreshment from an admirer, and it was then, in the brief lull between dances, that she turned her perfect face toward the corner where Eleanor stood, and said in a voice pitched to Carrie, "How kind of the dowager to bring her little lame companion. I do hope the poor creature is not too pained by watching others dance." And the words fell into sudden silence as heads turned and fans stilled, and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, even as she lifted her chin and said with a steadiness that surprised even herself, "I thank you for your concern, Lady Beatrice, but I find great pleasure in music whether or not I am able to dance to it," and she watched something ugly flash across Beatrice's beautiful features, watched Frederick go utterly still across the room, watched him see for the first time the cruelty that lived beneath the porcelain perfection he had chosen. And when his eyes met Eleanor's across the sea of watching faces, she saw something break open in him, something that looked like recognition, like regret, like the desperate understanding of a man who has just realized he has been reaching for guilt when gold stood quietly in the corner all along. And Eleanor held his gaze for one endless moment before she turned to help the dowager to her feet, her dignity intact, her heart in ruins, and her love for him burning brighter than any of the 200 candles that illuminated his terrible mistake. The dawn of May 6, 1814, crept through the small window of Eleanor's chamber beneath the eaves, painting the slanted ceiling in shades of pink and gold that seemed to mock the grayness of her heart as she sat at the tiny writing desk her father had given her when she was, her pen hovering over a sheet of paper that would end the only life she had known for 3 years, the ink still wet on the words, "I must respectfully tender my resignation," as she listened to the morning birds singing their oblivious songs outside, and wondered how the world could sound so beautiful when everything inside her had turned to ash. Her trunk stood half-packed in the corner, her few possessions already folded and placed with the careful precision of a woman who had learned long ago to take up as little space as possible, and she had not slept, had not even changed from her plain blue dress, had simply sat through the dark hours making her decision and then writing the letter that would free her from the exquisite torture of watching Frederick marry another woman while she stood in corners pretending her heart was not breaking with every breath. The door opened without warning, and the dowager swept in with more energy than a woman of her years should possess at such an hour, her sharp eyes taking in the trunk, the letter, the ravaged face Eleanor had not thought to hide, and before Eleanor could rise or speak or offer any explanation, the old woman crossed the room and took the letter from the desk, and read it once, twice, and then tore it neatly in half, with hands that trembled only slightly. "I will not accept this," the dowager said, her voice fierce with an emotion Eleanor could not name. "I will not let you run away because my grandson is a fool who cannot see what stands before him," and Eleanor felt something crack open inside her chest, felt the tears she had thought exhausted rise again as she whispered, "I cannot stay. I cannot watch him with her. I cannot pretend any longer that my heart does not shatter every time he looks through me as if I am nothing." And the dowager sat down heavily on the narrow bed and said with terrible gentleness, "You love him." And it was not a question, but a recognition. A naming of the truth Eleanor had hidden even from herself, until this moment when she could no longer deny it. "Yes," Eleanor breathed, and the word felt like surrender, like defeat, like the final admission of her own foolishness. "I love him, and I know I should not. I know I am nothing he could ever want. I know that a plain spinster with a limp and no fortune and a seamstress for a mother has no right to love a duke, but my heart did not ask my permission, and now I must leave before I shame myself further." The dowager opened her mouth to respond, but footsteps thundered in the corridor outside, urgent and unmistakable, and both women turned toward the door as it burst open, and Frederick stood there, disheveled and wild-eyed and still wearing his evening clothes from the ball, and his voice when he spoke was ragged with something that sounded almost like fear as he said, "You cannot leave, Eleanor. You cannot." And the world stopped turning. The morning light had shifted from pink to gold by the time Eleanor found her voice, and when she spoke it was with a steadiness she did not feel. A composure built from 27 years of learning to expect nothing and want less. And she said, "You cannot tell me what I can and cannot do. Your Grace, I am not yours to command." And she watched the words strike him like blows, watched him flinch as if she had reached across the small room and slapped his aristocratic face. And the dowager rose quietly from the narrow bed and slipped past her grandson with a look that contained multitudes, closing the door behind her with a soft click that left Eleanor and Frederick alone in a room that suddenly felt too small to contain everything that trembled between them. Frederick took a step toward her and then stopped, his hands clenching at his sides as if he did not trust them, his voice rough when he said, "I have been a fool. I have been blind and cruel, and everything my father was before me. I looked at you and saw only what society told me to see, a plain woman with a limp who could never be anything to a man of my position. And I was wrong, Eleanor. I was so desperately wrong." And she felt tears burning in her eyes, but she would not let them fall, would not give him the satisfaction of her weakness when he had given her nothing but pain for weeks. So she lifted her chin and asked the question that had been building inside her since he burst through her door. "What am I to you, then, if not nothing? What am I that you would chase me to this small room and beg me to stay when you have a beautiful woman waiting to become your Duchess?" He made a sound that was almost a laugh, and almost a sob, and he said, "I ended it. I went to Beatrice before dawn, and told her I could not marry her. I told her that I had discovered she was not the woman I thought she was. But the truth I could not speak to her, is that I have discovered I cannot marry anyone who is not you." And Eleanor's heart stopped beating for one endless moment before it resumed with a painful lurch, and she whispered, "You do not know what you are saying. You are tired and confused, and you will regret this when you have slept, when you remember who I am, and who you are, and the impossible distance between us." But Frederick crossed the remaining space between them, and took her hands in his grip warm and desperate and real, and he said, "I know exactly who you are. You are the woman who reads Plato in my library and walks in my gardens despite the pain it costs you. You are the woman who warned me of danger when you had nothing to gain. You are the woman whose quiet dignity puts every diamond-draped debutante to shame. You are Eleanor Whitmore, and I am begging you, do not leave me to a life without you in it." And Eleanor looked up into his eyes and saw something she had never dared to hope she would see, something that looked terrifyingly like love. And she could not yet believe it, could not yet trust that this was not a dream from which she would wake alone. But she did not pull her hands away, and that was enough. For now. The afternoon of May the 8th, 1814, brought the first true warmth of spring to Ashworth House, and Eleanor stood at the window of the Dowager's sitting room, watching the gardens come alive with colour she had not noticed in weeks. The early roses unfurling their petals in shades of pink and cream that seemed to echo the fragile hope blooming tentatively in her own chest as she tried to reconcile the Frederick who had burst into her room 2 days ago with the cold Duke who had once looked through her as if she were made of glass and air. The Dowager had been watching her with knowing eyes all morning, saying nothing but smiling in a way that made Eleanor blush and turn away. And when the door opened and Frederick entered without announcement, without the formality that had once marked his every interaction, Eleanor felt her heart leap into her throat, even as she told herself sternly that words spoken in desperation might not survive the light of day. But Frederick crossed the room with purpose and stopped before her and said in a voice that carried clearly enough for the Dowager and the 2 maids and the footman at the door to hear, "Miss Whitmore, the gardens are particularly fine this afternoon, and I would be honored if you would walk with me." And the request was so deliberate, so public, so clearly designed to announce his intentions to every servant who would carry the tale below stairs within the hour, that Eleanor could only stare at him for a long moment before the Dowager laughed softly and said, "Go, child, the roses will not wait forever." And Eleanor found herself taking Frederick's offered arm and walking through the halls of Ashworth House on the arm of its duke, while servants pressed themselves against walls and whispered behind their hands, and the whole world seemed to tilt on its axis. The gardens were indeed glorious, the gravel paths warm beneath her feet, and the sunshine falling on her face like a benediction. And Frederick walked slowly, matching his pace to hers without comment, without the impatience she had always expected from a man of his position, and when he asked her opinion on the placement of a new fountain his architect had proposed, she found herself answering honestly rather than deferentially, found herself disagreeing with his preference and defending her own view with the passion she usually reserved for discussions of philosophy with the dowager alone. Frederick listened, truly listened, his eyes on her face rather than the gardens around them, and when she finished he smiled, a real smile that transformed his severe features into something approaching handsome, and said, "You are right, and I am wrong, and I shall tell the architect so." And Eleanor felt something inside her begin to thaw, begin to believe that perhaps this was not a fever dream born of exhaustion and longing, but something real and possible and terrifying in its possibility. They walked for an hour, speaking of books and gardens and the reforms Frederick hoped to bring to his tenant farms, and Eleanor's limp seemed to pain her less when she was not thinking about it, when she was lost in conversation with a man who saw her, who heard her, who valued what she thought. And she did not notice Thomas Sinclair watching from an upper window, his face twisted with calculation and fury, plotting the destruction of everything she was only now beginning to believe she might deserve. The evening of May 12th, 1814, brought storm clouds rolling across the sky like dark promises, and Eleanor sat at the long dining table, feeling happiness she had scarcely dared to imagine possible, her hand resting near Frederick's on the white tablecloth, as the remaining guests made polite conversation and pretended not to notice the transformation that had overtaken the Duke of Ashworth in the span of a single week. The way his eyes softened when they found Eleanor across the room, the way he sought her opinion on matters of consequence and listened as if her words carried weight, and she had begun to believe, had begun to allow herself to dream of a future she had thought forever closed to a plain spinster with a limp and no fortune. When Thomas Sinclair rose from his seat with a glass of wine in his hand and a smile on his face that made Eleanor's blood run cold, he waited until the thunder rumbled in the distance and every eye turned toward him, and then he said in a voice that carried to every corner of the candle-lit room, "I propose a toast to truth, to the importance of knowing exactly who one allows into one's family, and I feel it my duty as Frederick's cousin and heir to reveal that Miss Whitmore's mother was not, as she has allowed everyone to believe, a gentlewoman, but rather a seamstress from the village, a woman who stitched shirts for her betters until the vicar took pity on her and raised her above her station, and the gasps that rippled through the assembled guests struck Eleanor like physical blows as she felt the fragile castle of her happiness crumbling around her. She could not look at Frederick, could not bear to see the disgust that must surely be dawning on his face as he realized he had been courting a woman whose blood was tainted by trade, whose very existence was a reminder that love sometimes crossed boundaries society deemed uncrossable. And she began to rise from her chair, her leg aching as it always did when she was distressed, prepared to flee to her small room and pack her trunk for real this time, when Frederick's hand closed around hers and held her in place. The lightning flashed outside the windows and illuminated his face as he rose to his feet, and his voice when he spoke was cold and clear as ice, cutting through the whispers like a blade, and he said, "My cousin speaks of truth, so let me offer some. Eleanor Whitmore's mother was indeed a seamstress, a woman who worked with her hands to survive, and Eleanor's father was a vicar who recognized quality of character over accident of birth, and their daughter inherited the best of both, dignity and intelligence, and a heart more generous than any I have encountered in all the ballrooms of London. And if any person in this room believes that the circumstances of her mother's employment diminish her worth, then that person may leave my house tonight and never return." And the silence that followed was broken only by the thunder rolling overhead as Frederick lifted Eleanor's trembling hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her fingers before the shocked faces of everyone assembled, and Thomas Sinclair's face twisted with fury as he realized his weapon had become the instrument of his own defeat. The morning of May 14th, 1814, dawned soft and golden over Ashworth House, the storm of 2 nights past having washed the world clean and left behind air that smelled of wet earth and new growth and possibility. And Eleanor stood at the window of the Dowager's sitting room, watching droplets of water catch the light on every leaf and petal in the garden below. Her heart still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what Frederick had done for her in the dining room when he had taken her trembling hand and declared her worth before everyone who mattered in his world, everyone who could destroy him with whispers and cold shoulders and doors closed forever against a duke who had chosen a seamstress's daughter over the expectations of his class. The house had been quiet these past 2 days, the remaining guests departing one by one with expressions ranging from scandalized to secretly admiring, and Thomas Sinclair had left before dawn the morning after his failed gambit, his face a mask of fury that Eleanor suspected she had not seen the last of, though Frederick had assured her that his cousin's power was broken now that his scheming had been exposed. The Dowager had spent the intervening time alternating between triumphant pronouncements about the superiority of character over breeding and gentle questioning of Eleanor about her feelings, her fears, her hopes for what might come next, and Eleanor had found herself unable to answer with any certainty because the fear still lingered beneath her joy like a shadow that would not quite disperse. The voice that whispered she was not enough, could never be enough, that Frederick would wake one morning and see her plainness and her limp and her common blood, and wonder what madness had possessed him. She was so lost in these thoughts that she did not hear the door open, did not sense his presence until Frederick spoke her name softly from across the room. And when she turned, she found him watching her with an expression she was only beginning to recognize, something tender and fierce and wholly focused on her in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. He crossed to her slowly, deliberately, as if approaching a wild creature he feared might bolt, and when he reached her he took both her hands in his and said, "You are thinking that I will change my mind, that I will wake from this dream and regret everything. And I need you to understand that the only regret I carry is the weeks I wasted pretending I did not see you, pretending you were invisible, when in truth you were the only thing in any room that I could see." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she looked up at him, this severe and handsome man who had once declared she would never be anything of consequence, and she said, "I am afraid," and he nodded, as if this was exactly what he expected, and said, "Then let me be brave enough for both of us until you learn to believe what I already know, that you are worthy of everything I can give you and more besides." And his certainty began to crack the last defenses around her heart, began to let light into places that had been dark for so very long. The afternoon of May the 14th, 1814, found Eleanor and Frederick walking together through the gardens that had become their sanctuary, the paths now lined with roses in full bloom, their petals heavy with the moisture left behind by the storm that had witnessed Frederick's declaration of her worth. And Eleanor found herself marveling at how different the world looked when seen through eyes no longer clouded by the certainty of her own insignificance. The colors brighter and the air sweeter, and the future stretching before her like an unwritten page waiting to be filled with words she had never dared to imagine. Frederick walked slowly to match her pace, his arm steady beneath her hand, and he did not speak for a long while, content simply to be beside her in the golden light that filtered through the leaves overhead. And when he finally broke the silence, his voice was soft with an emotion she was only beginning to recognize as vulnerability, the careful lowering of walls he had spent a lifetime building. He told her of his father's marriage, the cold formality of it, the way his mother had withered year by year in a union built on nothing but proper bloodlines and social advantage, and he confessed that he had sworn never to repeat that mistake. Had believed that the answer was to marry someone beautiful enough that he might at least enjoy looking at her across the breakfast table during the long, silent years ahead. "But I was wrong," he said, stopping beneath an arbor heavy with climbing roses, their fragrance surrounding them like a blessing. "I thought beauty was the only compensation for a loveless match, and I never considered that there might be another way entirely, that I might find someone who made me want to speak at breakfast, who made silence feel like deprivation rather than relief." Eleanor felt her heart swell with something too large to name as she looked up at him. This man who had once declared her nothing of consequence, who now looked at her as if she held the answer to every question he had ever asked. And she said, "I spent so many years believing I was invisible, that my limp and my plain face and my common blood made me unworthy of being seen, and you have given me a gift I do not know how to repay, the gift of being looked at and found valuable." Frederick lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her palm, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. And he said, "You owe me nothing, Eleanor. It is I who am in your debt. For you have shown me that the things I thought mattered are dust compared to the treasure of a mind that matches my own, and a heart brave enough to love despite every reason to protect itself. And I intend to spend whatever years remain to me proving that I am worthy of the gift you have given me in return." The roses nodded in the gentle breeze as if in approval, and somewhere in the house behind them the dowager watched from her window with tears of joy streaming down her weathered cheeks, and Eleanor allowed herself at last to believe that this impossible happiness might truly be hers to keep. The evening of May the 14th, 1814, brought with it the kind of quiet that Eleanor had never known was possible in the great house. A stillness that felt less like absence and more like presence, like the held breath before a momentous word is spoken, and she found herself seated in the dowager's sitting room as the last light of day painted the west windows in shades of amber and rose, her hands for once idle in her lap, rather than busy with some task designed to justify her existence in rooms where she had always believed she did not belong. The dowager had retired early, pressing a kiss to Eleanor's forehead with a tenderness that made her throat ache, and Frederick had disappeared into his study with his man of business to address the matters of the estate that had been neglected during the tumultuous weeks just past, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and the extraordinary reality that her life had become something she could never have imagined when she first limped through these doors 3 years ago, a plain vicar's daughter with nothing to recommend her but her education and her willingness to fade into the background of other people's lives. She thought of her father, dead these 5 years now, and wondered what he would make of the daughter he had raised on Latin and Greek and the radical notion that a woman's mind was worth cultivating. The daughter who had believed herself destined for a life of quiet service and grateful obscurity, now sitting in a duke's house contemplating a future that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The door opened, and Frederick entered without announcement, as had become his habit since the morning he had found her packing her trunk, and Eleanor felt her heart lift at the sight of him, even as she marveled that such a response was possible, that she who had spent so many years believing herself unworthy of being seen could now feel joy simply because a man walked into a room. He crossed to where she sat and lowered himself into the chair beside her, close enough that she could smell the sandalwood of his soap and see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, content simply to exist in the same space while the evening light faded around them. Then Frederick reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box that made Eleanor's breath catch. And he said, "This belonged to my mother, and before her to my grandmother, and before her to women whose names I do not know, but whose blood runs in my veins, and I have carried it with me for 3 days, waiting for the right moment. But I have come to understand that there is no right moment. There is only this moment, and you, and the fact that I cannot imagine any future worth living that does not have you at its center." He opened the box to reveal a ring of gold set with a single sapphire the color of twilight, and Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks as he took her hand and asked the question that changed everything, the question she answered with a single word that contained all the hope she had ever feared to feel. The morning of May 15th, 1814, dawned clear and golden over Ashworth House, and Eleanor woke to a world transformed not merely by the ring that now rested on her finger, but by the profound shift in how the household regarded her. The servants who had once whispered about her limp and her plain face now curtsying deeply and addressing her as Miss Whitmore with a deference that made her want to laugh and weep in equal measure, for she was still the same woman who had arrived 3 years ago in a faded grey dress with nothing to recommend her but her Latin and her willingness to be invisible. Mrs. Martha Pennington appeared at her door before she had finished dressing. Her weathered face creased with a smile that spoke of genuine joy rather than mere duty. And she brought with her a breakfast tray laden with delicacies that Eleanor had never before been offered, chocolate and fresh pastries and hothouse fruit that seemed almost obscene in their luxury. And when Eleanor protested that she had not yet earned such treatment, the housekeeper simply shook her head and said, "You earned it the moment you chose to see the man beneath the title, miss, for there are precious few who ever bothered to look." The dowager summoned Eleanor to her sitting room at 10 o'clock, and when Eleanor entered, she found the old woman surrounded by correspondence, letters from every great house in England inquiring about the astonishing news that the Duke of Ashworth had thrown over the diamond of the season for a lame companion of common blood, and the dowager's eyes sparkled with mischief as she reported that Lady Beatrice Langdon had taken to her bed with nervous prostration and was refusing all callers, while Lord Thomas Sinclair had departed for the continent with suspicious haste, leaving behind debts that suggested his schemes had been even more desperate than Eleanor had known. Frederick found her there an hour later, striding into his grandmother's sitting room without announcement, as had become his habit, and the sight of him still made Eleanor's breath catch, not because of his handsome face or his title, but because of the way he looked at her, as if she were the answer to a question he had spent his whole life asking without knowing what he sought. He crossed to where she sat and took her hand, lifting it to his lips to press a kiss to the place where his ring encircled her finger, and he said, "I have spent the morning with my solicitors, making arrangements for the wedding, and I find I am impatient in a way I have never been before. For every hour that passes without you as my wife feels like time stolen from the life we should be living." Eleanor felt a smile spread across her face, unguarded and genuine in a way she had never allowed herself before these past impossible days, and she said, "I have spent 27 years learning patience. Your Grace, surely you can manage a few weeks more." And Frederick laughed, a sound so rare and wonderful that the dowager clapped her hands in delight, and he replied, "I have told you before, Eleanor, when we are alone you must call me Frederick, for I find I am weary of being your Grace to everyone, and longing to be simply a man to someone, and you are the only someone I want." The weeks that followed the engagement passed in a blur of preparation and wonder that Eleanor could scarcely believe was her own life unfolding rather than some story she had read in the pages of a novel, and she found herself swept into a world of dress fittings and menu consultations and endless correspondence with great houses whose inhabitants she had never dreamed would acknowledge her existence, let alone write to congratulate her on securing the most eligible duke in England. Lady Sophia Greville arrived on May 20th, summoned by a letter Eleanor had written with trembling hands the day after Frederick placed his ring on her finger, and when her childhood friend descended from her carriage and saw Eleanor standing on the steps of Ashworth House, she let out a cry of joy that echoed across the courtyard and swept Eleanor into an embrace so fierce that it left them both laughing and weeping in equal measure. "You impossible creature," Sophia declared when she finally released her. "How dare you write me such a modest letter when you have accomplished the most extraordinary feat in the history of matrimony? For I have heard nothing in London these past days but talk of the Duke who threw over a diamond for a vicar's daughter, and half the ton believes you must be a witch while the other half suspects you are secretly a princess in disguise." Eleanor laughed at that, a sound that still felt foreign in her throat after so many years of practiced silence. And she said, "I am neither witch nor Princess Sophia, I am only myself." And somehow that was enough. And even as she spoke the words, she marveled at their truth, at the extraordinary reality that Frederick had chosen her, not despite her plainness and her limp and her common mother, but because he saw in her something that transcended the shallow metrics by which society measured worth. The wedding was set for June 15th, a date that seemed impossibly soon and impossibly distant all at once, and Eleanor spent her days in a constant state of anticipation that made her pulse quicken whenever Frederick entered a room, which he did with increasing frequency, as if he too could not bear to be parted from her for long. He took to joining her in the library each afternoon, ostensibly to review estate matters, but in truth simply to sit beside her while she read, his hand finding hers across the space between their chairs. And Eleanor discovered that silence could be a form of intimacy more profound than any words when shared with someone who truly saw you. The Dowager watched their courtship with undisguised satisfaction, frequently remarking that she had known from the moment Eleanor translated that Catullus at dinner that the girl would be the making of her grandson, and when Eleanor protested that the Dowager gave her too much credit, the old woman simply smiled and said, "I give credit where it is due, my dear, for you have accomplished what no diamond of any season ever could. You have taught a man who feared love to embrace it, and that is no small thing." Eleanor carried those words with her like a talisman against the doubts that still sometimes crept in at night, whispering that she was not worthy, that Frederick would wake one morning and see her as the world saw her, plain and lame and ordinary, but each morning brought fresh evidence that his choice was real and lasting and hers.